Sometimes a man loses so much that all he has left is the work of his hands and the hope of one more sunrise. Hank was that man. 61 years old, living on a broken-down boat, with nothing but the ocean and his memories. His wife had passed. His children blamed him. The courts took everything else. Every morning he cast his nets into the cold water, praying for something to sell, something to eat. Then one foggy dawn, he pulled up a rusted metal capsule sealed tight as a grave. Inside was a Cold War survival pod with old supplies and documents, but in a hidden compartment he found a notebook with his father's name, the father who disappeared at sea 50 years ago. What secrets did that notebook hold? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is truly unforgettable. The boat creaked beneath Hank's weight as he moved across the deck, every plank and beam familiar as his own weathered hands. The second chance wasn't much to look at anymore. Paint peeling in long strips, rust blooming across the railings like some kind of slow-growing disease, the cabin door hanging crooked on hinges that should have been replaced 5 years ago. But she floated, and she was his, and in the grey hours before dawn when the harbour still slept, that was enough. Hank stood at the stern, coffee mug warming his palms, watching the first light touch the water. 61 years old, and he could count his possessions on 2 hands. The boat, his father's old fishing gear, maintained with a care that bordered on reverence, a duffel bag of clothes, a photograph of Linda tucked in a frame that had survived better than most of his life's acquisitions, and now this mysterious capsule resting in his cabin, waiting to reveal whatever secrets it held. The harbour was beginning to stir. Across the dock, old Irving emerged from the harbour master's office, thermos in hand, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints announced the weather before any forecast could. Irving had been working these docks since before Hank was born, had known Hank's father, had watched 3 generations of fishermen come and go like the tides themselves. "You're up early," Irving called across the water, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Couldn't sleep," Hank replied, which was true enough. The capsule had seen to that. Irving nodded, asking nothing more. That was the way of men who'd spent their lives around the water. They understood that some silences carried more weight than words, and they respected the space a man needed to carry his burdens. Hank's mind drifted backward, as it often did in these quiet hours. 28 years he'd been married to Linda. 28 years of a life that felt, in retrospect, almost borrowed from someone else's story. She'd been a teacher, patient and kind, with a laugh that could lighten even his darkest moods. They'd raised 2 boys in a small house 3 blocks from the water, close, enough that Hank could walk to the docks each morning, far enough that Linda didn't have to smell fish guts every time she hung laundry. Gregory came first, serious even as a child, always watching, always thinking. Then Paul, 2 years later, easier with his smiles, but harder to read beneath the surface. Hank had taught them both to fish, had hoped at least one might follow him into the trade. Neither had. Gregory became an accountant, moved to Portland, married a woman Hank had met exactly twice. Paul went into real estate, stayed closer to home, but might as well have been on the moon for all the connection they maintained. The divorce, if you could call it that when one party was already gone, had been brutal in its simplicity. Linda's cancer had taken 18 months to kill her, and another 6 months for the medical bills to kill everything else. The house went first, then the savings, then the truck. By the time she passed, Hank was underwater in debt and drowning in grief. And his sons, his boys, had looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt, and he honestly couldn't tell which cut deeper. The custody battle made no sense to anyone, including the judge who'd presided over it. The boys were grown men with their own lives. But they'd come at him anyway, claiming he was unfit, unstable, dangerous to be around their own children. Grandchildren Hank barely knew. They'd painted him as a drunk, a failure, a man who'd squandered their mother's final months on the boat instead of at her bedside. Some of it was true. Not all, but some. Enough. The court had ruled in their favor, more out of exhaustion than conviction, Hank suspected. Restraining orders, supervised visitation, a list of conditions that amounted to, stay away from your family unless we say otherwise. And they never said otherwise. So Hank had come back to the water, because the water didn't judge and didn't take sides, and didn't care about restraining orders or past mistakes. He'd moved on to the second chance full-time, living in the cabin that smelled of mildew and old rope, fishing every day that weather allowed, selling what little he caught to the processors who paid bottom dollar because they knew he had nowhere else to go. The other fishermen kept their distance, not out of cruelty. Working men rarely were cruel without cause, but out of a kind of superstitious caution. Hank had become known as unlucky, and in a trade where luck mattered as much as skill. That was a reputation that followed you like a shadow. Empty nets week after week, engine troubles, a broken winch that nearly took his hand. Small disasters that added up to the undeniable conclusion that Hank was touched by something dark and best avoided. Only Dwight still talked to him regularly. Dwight was younger, 40-something, with a wife and 3 kids, and a boat that was only slightly less decrepit than Hank's. They'd met 5 years back, when Dwight was new to the harbor and hadn't yet learned about Hank's reputation. By the time he had, they were already friends, or as close to friends as 2 men could be, when one was living proof that fishing could destroy you, and the other was still naive enough to believe it wouldn't happen to him. "You need anything, you let me know," Dwight had said last week, after another run of empty nets had left Hank eating canned beans for the 3rd day straight. "I'm serious, Hank. Don't let pride get in the way." But pride was about all Hank had left, so he'd smiled and thanked him and pretended everything was fine, the way men did when everything was decidedly not fine. The harbor continued to wake around him. Boats fired up their engines, coughing diesel smoke into the morning air. Gulls began their daily complaints, circling and diving for scraps. The sun cleared the eastern hills, turning the water from grey to silver to something almost beautiful. Hank finished his coffee and set the mug aside. His hands found familiar work without conscious thought, checking lines, examining nets, testing the winch that had been acting temperamental lately. His body knew these rhythms, had performed them 10,000 times, would perform them 10,000 more if he lived that long. But his mind was elsewhere, caught on the capsule in the cabin and the notebook with his father's handwriting. Hank's father, also named Hank, though everyone had called him Big Hank to avoid confusion, had disappeared in 1973. Hank had been 11 years old, and he remembered it with the kind of clarity that childhood trauma burns into memory. His father had left for a routine fishing trip on a Tuesday morning. The weather had been good, the forecast clear. He was an experienced fisherman, careful, respected. He should have been back by Friday evening. Saturday came and went. Sunday, his mother called the Coast Guard. They'd searched for 3 days, covering hundreds of square miles of ocean. Found nothing. Not wreckage, not a life preserver. Not a single piece of evidence that Big Hank had ever been out there at all. The official conclusion, lost at sea, presumed drowned. The boat had probably capsized, they said. A rogue wave, maybe, or a mechanical failure. These things happened. His mother never believed it. She'd insisted something else had occurred, though she could never say what. She'd spent years writing letters to authorities, making phone calls, pursuing dead ends. It had consumed her, turned her bitter and withdrawn. She died when Hank was 32, still convinced her husband had been taken from her by something more sinister than the sea. Hank had inherited her doubt, but none of her determination. What good did it do to chase ghosts? His father was gone, had been gone longer than he'd been present in Hank's life. You learned to live with absence. You moved forward. You didn't spend decades picking at a wound that would never heal. Except now this capsule had appeared in his nets, as if the sea had decided it was time to return what it had taken. And inside, his father's handwriting, speaking across 50 years of silence. Hank looked toward his cabin, where the capsule waited. He needed to examine it properly, read through the notebook carefully, understand what his father had left behind. But something held him back, a fear, maybe, of what he might find. Some truths were better left buried. Some questions were never meant to be answered. The morning stretched ahead, full of familiar routines and empty nets, and the slow erosion of hope that came with poverty. But beneath it all now was this new current, this possibility that his father's story wasn't finished, and that perhaps his own story might have a few more chapters left to write. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, the kind that swallowed sound and turned the world into something soft and uncertain. Hank had motored out slowly, running lights cutting pale circles through the grey, his radar pinging steadily to warn him of obstacles he couldn't see. The forecast called for clearing by midday, but forecasts were often wrong, and Hank had learned to trust his instincts over predictions. He'd run his nets in the usual spots, the ones that rarely produced any more, but were familiar enough that he could work them half asleep. The morning had been quiet, just the throb of the engine and the cry of invisible gulls somewhere overhead. When the winch groaned with unexpected weight, Hank had assumed he'd snagged bottom, caught his net on rocks or old wreckage, the kind of frustration that could cost him half a day of work and money he didn't have for repairs. But the strain felt different. Not the dead resistance of something caught, but the heavy pull of something substantial being lifted through water. Hank had worked the winch carefully, listening to every mechanical complaint, ready to cut the line if things went wrong. His shoulders burned with the effort, muscles that were still strong but no longer young protesting the work. When the net finally broke surface, seawater streaming from its mesh, Hank saw the object immediately. It was roughly cylindrical, perhaps 4 feet long and 18 inches in diameter, covered in barnacles and trailing seaweed, like some creature from the deep. The metal underneath the growth was dark with rust and corrosion, but unmistakably man-made. Getting it aboard had been a fight. The thing must have weighed 200 pounds, and the Second Chance's deck was slick with spray. Hank had rigged a line through the cargo hook, swung it over the gunwale, and lowered it with shaking arms onto the deck where it landed with a solid thunk that spoke of dense metal and watertight seals. For a long moment, he'd just stood there, breathing hard, staring at this impossible thing that had come up from the depths. The barnacles were old, years of growth. Whatever this was, it had been down there a long time. Hank had pulled his knife and carefully scraped away the marine life, revealing metal underneath. The cylinder was constructed of heavy steel, or perhaps some alloy, with riveted seams, and what looked like a locking mechanism at one end. Stenciled markings emerged from beneath the crust, Cyrillic letters, faded but still visible, and a date, 1971, Soviet. This was Soviet equipment, lying off the Oregon coast for more than 50 years. His hands had trembled as he'd examined the locking mechanism. It was corroded but still functional, a simple turn and lift design meant to be operated even with cold, wet hands. 3 decades of fishing told Hank that opening this could be dangerous. Old containers sometimes held chemicals, fuel, things that didn't age well. But curiosity won over caution, the way it always did. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air, surprisingly dry, suggesting the container had remained watertight all these years. Hank lifted the heavy lid, hinges protesting, and looked inside. The capsule was lined with rubber or some synthetic material, still intact despite the years. Inside, carefully packed, were supplies. Vacuum-sealed packages of what looked like dried food, their labels in Cyrillic script. A medical kit, its contents visible through a clear plastic case. Emergency flares in waterproof tubes. A hand crank radio. Everything you'd need to survive for weeks if you were stranded at sea. But it was the inner compartment that changed everything. Hank had almost missed it. A second seal built into the base of the capsule, flush with the lining. His fingers found the edge by accident, and when he pried it up, he discovered a space perhaps 6 inches deep, lined with oiled cloth that had kept its contents dry. Inside was a notebook. The cover was leather, cracked with age but intact. The pages were handwritten in English, in a script Hank recognized instantly. The same blocky, careful handwriting that had signed his report cards and birthday cards, and the note that had been left on the kitchen table that last Tuesday morning. Back by Friday. Love you both. His father's handwriting. Hank's legs had given out then, and he'd sat down hard on the deck, the notebook clutched in both hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. This made no sense. His father had drowned in 1973. The Coast Guard had searched. There'd been a memorial service. His mother had received the official death certificate. This notebook couldn't exist, and yet here it was, solid and real and impossible. With shaking hands, Hank opened to the first page. The entry was dated June 14th, 1973, a week before his father disappeared. Weatherfare. Caught 20 pounds of rockfish off Miller's Point. HW says the route is changing. Need to adjust my schedule. Routine fishing notes, the kind his father had kept for years. But who was HW? Hank flipped forward. More entries, more catches, more references to HW, and the route, and deliveries. Then, 3 days before his father vanished. Met with the Dutchman. He's worried about the new surveillance. Says we need to be more careful. Took payment for the last 3 runs. Should be enough to fix the boat and put some aside. Don't like this work, but a man does what he must to provide. Hank's throat tightened. What work? What deliveries? His father had been a fisherman. Nothing more, except the evidence suggested otherwise. He continued reading, his fingers leaving smudges on the old paper. The entries became more cryptic, more cautious. References to coordinates, to meeting times, to being behind schedule. And then, the final entry, dated 3 days before his father's boat was found empty. They know. Don't know how, but they know. The federal people, not the Dutchman's people. Offered me a choice, testify and disappear, or face charges. Can't let them touch my family. Can't let Hank and Mary suffer for my mistakes. If you're reading this, son, I didn't make it back. The truth is in the coordinates below. The numbers will lead you to the other drops. I'm sorry. I did this for you, for your mother. Forgive me. Below were a series of latitude and longitude coordinates, 6 sets in total, each marked with a date from 1972 or 1973. Photographs slipped out from between the pages as Hank turned them. His father, younger than Hank remembered him, standing on an unfamiliar dock with 3 men Hank didn't recognize. All of them looked serious, no smiles, the kind of photograph taken for records rather than memories. The back was labeled in his father's handwriting. Last run, June 73. Another photograph showed young Hank himself, maybe 10 years old, holding a fish nearly as big as he was, grinning at the camera. His father had carried this picture with him, kept it in this capsule, meant for emergencies. The thought broke something in Hank's chest. He sat on the deck of the Second Chance for an hour, maybe more, reading and rereading his father's words, studying the photographs, trying to understand. His father hadn't drowned, or if he had, it hadn't been an accident. He'd been involved in something, smuggling, maybe, or something worse, and it had cost him everything. The Coast Guard's search made sense now. They hadn't found the boat because there was nothing to find. His father had either been disappeared by whoever he'd been working for, or he'd entered witness protection after agreeing to testify. Either way, he'd vanished by design, not by misfortune. And he'd left this capsule behind, hidden in the ocean, with coordinates that suggested there were more drops, more secrets, more evidence of a life Hank had never known his father lived. The fog was lifting when Hank finally stood, his joints stiff from sitting, his mind racing. He looked at the notebook in his hands, at the photographs, at the coordinates that promised answers and threatened revelations. He could drop the capsule back overboard, let it sink back to wherever it had rested for 50 years. Pretend he'd never found it. Let the past stay buried. But he'd spent 50 years not knowing, 50 years believing his father had been claimed by the sea, a simple tragedy, a common story among fishing families. Now he knew different, and knowing changed everything. Sleep didn't come that night. Hank lay in his narrow bunk, the cabin lit by a single battery-powered lamp, the notebook open on his chest. He read through every entry twice, then 3 times, committing the words to memory, searching for meaning in the gaps between sentences. The photograph of himself as a boy kept drawing his attention. He remembered that day, the thrill of catching a fish that big, the pride in his father's eyes, the way Big Hank had insisted on taking a picture, even though film was expensive and cameras were for special occasions. His father had made him feel like a king that afternoon, and all the while, apparently, Big Hank had been working for smugglers, or with them. The distinction seemed important, though Hank couldn't articulate why. He thought about his mother, dead 29 years now, and wondered what she'd known. Had she suspected? Was that why she'd never accepted the official story? Why she'd spent years insisting something else had happened? Or had she been as ignorant as Hank, living beside a man whose secret life remained perfectly hidden? The questions multiplied faster than any answers could form. By dawn, Hank had made a decision. He needed help, needed someone who might understand what these cryptic references meant, who could provide context for a world he'd never been part of. The coordinates were useless to him without understanding what they pointed to, and the notebook's references to the Dutchman and H.W. meant nothing without someone who remembered that era. Irving would remember. Irving remembered everything about the harbor's history, had been present for every significant event in the last 60 years. If anyone could shed light on what Big Hank had been involved in, it would be the old harbor master. Hank found him at the dock office just after sunrise, hunched over paperwork that probably should have been digitized decades ago, but never would be, not while Irving was still breathing. The old man looked up when Hank knocked, his weathered face breaking into a cautious smile. "Twice in 2 days," Irving said. "Must be something on your mind." Hank stepped inside, closed the door behind him. The office smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular mustiness that came from spending 50 years in the same small space. He set the capsule on Irving's desk. He'd brought it along, unable to leave it unattended on the boat. Irving's eyebrows rose. "What's this, then?" "Pulled it up yesterday. Cold War survival pod. Soviet made. Hank opened it, showed him the contents. But that's not the interesting part. He handed Irving the notebook, watched the old man's face carefully. Irving's expression shifted as he paged through it. Recognition, flickering in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like alarm. "Where'd you get this?" Irving's voice had gone quiet. "It was inside, hidden compartment." Hank pulled out the photographs, laid them on the desk. "That's my father. June 1973, 3 days before he disappeared." Irving stared at the photograph for a long moment, then set it down carefully, as if it might explode. "Hank, son, I think you should put this back where you found it. What do you know about this?" "Nothing I want to remember." Irving stood, walked to his small window overlooking the harbor. That summer, 1973, there was trouble. Boats coming and going at odd hours, people asking questions, federal agents nosing around. Your father wasn't the only fisherman involved, but he was one of them. Involved in what? Irving sighed, the sound carrying decades of weight. Smuggling mostly. Not drugs. This was before the cartels got organized. Information, sometimes equipment, small packages, dropped at specific coordinates, picked up by other boats. The fishermen were middlemen, paid well enough to keep quiet and not ask questions. Who was paying them? Soviets, through intermediaries. This was Cold War territory, Hank. The Pacific coast was a highway for intelligence work, both sides running operations. Your father... Irving paused, choosing his words carefully. Big Hank was a good man in a bad situation. He needed money. Your mother was pregnant with you. Times were hard. Someone offered him cash for simple work, and he took it. Hank felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened to him? Don't know for certain, but that summer, several fishermen disappeared. Not at sea, just vanished. Gone one day, families left behind with no answers. Coast Guard called it accidents. But we knew better. Irving turned back to face him. There was a cleanup operation. Federal authorities discovered the smuggling network, started making arrests. Some of the fishermen cut deals, disappeared into witness protection. Others just disappeared. Which was my father? I don't know, son. I honestly don't know. But this... He gestured at the notebook. This suggests he knew trouble was coming. Maybe he left it for you, maybe for himself, a backup plan if things went wrong. Either way, it's 50 years old, and whoever was involved is either dead or doesn't want to be found. Hank picked up the photograph again, studied the faces of the men standing with his father. Who are these people? Irving squinted at the image. Can't say for certain, but the tall one on the left, that might be the Dutchman, ran a supply boat, legitimate business as cover. He was the connection between the fishermen and the people actually running the operation. Is he still alive? Died in '82. Boat fire in Seattle, probably not an accident. Irving's expression was grim. Hank, listen to me. Whatever happened back then, it's done. Going after answers now could stir up things better, left alone. My father left coordinates, 6 of them. Whatever he was involved in, he wanted someone to know where it happened, what was there. Or he wanted to protect himself, leave evidence in case he needed leverage. Irving shook his head. This isn't treasure, son. These are burial sites, metaphorically speaking, places where secrets got dropped and forgotten. But Hank was already thinking ahead. The first coordinate set was marked with the earliest date, April 1972. If he could reach that location, use his sonar equipment to scan the bottom, he might find something. Maybe nothing of value, but at least answers. At least truth. I need to know, Hank said quietly, Spent my whole life thinking he drowned, that the sea took him the way it takes so many. Now I find out it was something else entirely, and I can't just ignore that." Irving studied him for a long moment, then sighed in resignation. "You're as stubborn as he was." "Fine, but be careful. And Hank, if you find something that looks dangerous, something that makes you think twice, you call me first. Don't go playing hero with people who might still care about keeping these secrets buried." Hank gathered the notebook and photographs, secured them back in the capsule. "Who else knew about this? About what my father was doing?" "Half the harbor suspected something. Few knew for certain. Your mother—" Irving hesitated. "Mary came to me after he vanished, asked if I knew anything. I told her what little I could without putting her in danger. She didn't believe the official story because she knew him well enough to know he wouldn't have taken risks at sea. She was right, just not in the way she thought. She died thinking he'd drowned. Better that than knowing the truth, maybe." Irving's voice was gentle. "Sometimes ignorance is a kindness." But Hank didn't want kindness. He wanted knowledge, understanding, the truth about who his father had been and why he'd made the choices he'd made. The notebook had opened a door into the past, and Hank intended to walk through it, regardless of what waited on the other side. He left Irving's office with more questions than answers, but at least now he had context. His father had been a smuggler, working for Soviet operatives, caught in something far larger than a simple fishing operation. And whatever had happened to him, it hadn't been random chance or cruel fate. It had been consequence, the price of choices made in desperation. The second chance waited at her mooring, patient and familiar. Hank stood on the dock, looking at his boat, at the water beyond, at the horizon where answers might lie hidden beneath fathoms of cold Pacific darkness. Tomorrow he'd prepare for a journey to the first coordinates. Tonight he had more reading to do. Hank spent the afternoon at the public library, a modest brick building 3 blocks from the waterfront that smelled of old paper and the particular silence that libraries cultivated. He'd never been much of a reader, preferring the practical education of the ocean to anything found in books. But now he needed information that only archives could provide. The librarian at the reference desk was a woman named Coraline, somewhere in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades organizing information. When Hank explained he was researching local maritime history from the early 1970s, she'd brightened immediately. "That's actually my specialty," she said, leading him to a back room lined with filing cabinets and boxes. "I've been documenting the harbor's history for 20 years. What specifically are you looking for?" Hank hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "My father was a fisherman. Disappeared in 1973. I'm trying to understand what happened." Coraline's expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." She pulled open a drawer, flipped through folders. 1973 was an interesting year locally. There were several disappearances that summer, all fishermen, all experienced. The official reports blamed weather and accidents, but she paused, glancing at him. There were rumors of other explanations. "What kind of rumors?" She pulled out a folder, laid it on a nearby table. Inside were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, protected in plastic sleeves. Smuggling operations, intelligence work. The Cold War was very real on this coast, Mr. Just Hank. Hank. She smiled briefly. The Pacific Northwest was strategic territory. Soviet submarines operated off the coast, monitoring naval installations, communication stations, and where there's intelligence gathering, there's usually a network of support, people on land providing information, supplies, coordination. She showed him articles spanning from 1972 to 1974. Missing fishermen, Coast Guard investigations that went nowhere, federal agents interviewing harbor workers, a photograph of 3 boats seized in Seattle, their captains arrested on smuggling charges. "Were any of these men ever found?" Hank asked, studying the names in the articles. None matched his father's. Not that made the papers, but Coraline pulled another folder, this one unmarked. "I've done some independent research, cross-referenced missing persons reports with federal court records, witness protection program filings that later became public. At least 4 of the missing fishermen from that summer appear in sealed documents related to espionage cases." Hank's pulse quickened. Witness protection? It's speculation, but the timing matches. The government was cracking down on Soviet intelligence networks, offering deals to low-level operators in exchange for testimony. Fishermen were perfect candidates. They had information, but weren't ideologically committed. Give them new identities, relocate them, and suddenly you've got witnesses without worrying about their families being targeted. The idea that his father might have survived, might have lived decades under a different name while Hank and his mother mourned, was almost too much to process. Hank pulled out the photograph from his jacket, slid it across the table. "Do you recognize any of these men?" Coraline studied it carefully, then pointed to the figure Irving had identified as the Dutchman. This man operated a supply boat called the North Wind. He was arrested in 1973, released 6 months later without charges, died in a boat fire in 1982. Investigators suspected arson but couldn't prove it. And the others? I'd need to research, compare faces to other photographs from that era. But if you leave this with me, I can try to identify them. She looked up, her expression serious. "Why now, Hank? What made you start looking into this after all these years?" He told her about the capsule, the notebook, the coordinates. Coraline listened without interrupting, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table when he finished. "That's extraordinary," she said quietly. "Physical evidence from the actual operations. Most of what I have is circumstantial. Newspaper reports, rumors, documents with sections redacted. But a first-hand account from someone inside the network that could answer questions I've been chasing for 2 decades. I need to follow the coordinates," Hank said. "See what's there. That could be dangerous. If there's anything substantial at those locations, others might still be interested in keeping it hidden. It's been 50 years. Intelligence work has a long memory." Coraline gathered the folders, tapped them into alignment. "But I understand the need to know. If you're going to do this, at least let me help. I have resources, contacts who might provide context. And if you find anything significant, I'd appreciate the opportunity to document it, with your permission, of course." Hank considered. He'd spent years isolated, trusting no one, handling everything alone. But this was bigger than he could manage solo, and Coraline clearly had knowledge he lacked. "All right," he agreed, "but carefully. I don't want to put you at risk. I've been researching Cold War operations for 20 years without incident. I know how to be discreet." She smiled. "Besides, this is exactly the kind of mystery that makes all those hours in dusty archives worthwhile." They spent the next 2 hours going through her collection. Coraline had compiled an impressive archive, not just newspaper clippings, but declassified federal documents, maritime records, interview transcripts from later investigations. A picture emerged of systematic operations spanning years, involving dozens of fishermen and support personnel, moving everything from documents to equipment to occasionally people fleeing Soviet defection. The fishermen were ideal, Coraline explained. They had legitimate reasons to be at sea, knew the waters intimately, operated independently, so unusual behavior wouldn't be noticed. Pay them enough, and they'd make drops and pickups without understanding the larger operation. Was it just about money? Hank asked, thinking of his father's notebook entry about providing for his family. Usually. These weren't ideologues or spies in the traditional sense. They were working men who needed extra income and were willing to take risks. Some probably told themselves it wasn't really harmful, just moving packages, no violence, no direct espionage. Others knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. Which category had his father fallen into? Hank suspected he'd never know for certain. The notebook suggested guilt, awareness that the work was dangerous and wrong. But it also showed pragmatism, a man doing what he felt necessary to survive. Before leaving, Coraline made copies of several documents, sealed them in an envelope. Background information on the era and the operations. It might help you understand what you find at those coordinates. Thank you, Hank said, meaning it. One more thing. Coraline's expression turned serious. If anyone asks what you're researching, be vague. Don't mention the capsule or the coordinates. Just say you're trying to understand your father's death for personal closure. The less attention you draw, the safer you'll be. Walking back to the harbor, Hank felt the weight of the envelope in his jacket, the notebook secure in his other pocket. The world had shifted in the last 24 hours, had revealed layers he'd never suspected existed. His father wasn't the simple fisherman Hank had always believed him to be. His mother's suspicions had been justified. And somewhere in the cold water off the Oregon coast were sites that might hold evidence of operations that had shaped lives and destroyed families. At the boat, Hank found signs that someone had been aboard in his absence. Nothing obvious. The lock wasn't broken, nothing appeared stolen. But small displacements. His coffee mug moved 6 inches from where he'd left it. The cabin door not quite latched. A sense of violation that came from knowing someone had invaded his space. He checked the capsule first. Still there, still sealed. Whoever had searched hadn't found it, or hadn't recognized its significance. But they'd been looking for something, and that meant someone knew about his discovery. Hank installed a better lock that evening, wedged a chair against the cabin door from inside, and slept with the capsule within arm's reach. Tomorrow he'd prepare the second chance for a journey to the first coordinates. Tonight he'd stay vigilant, alert to footsteps on the dock, to boats idling too close, to the possibility that the past he was uncovering wanted to remain buried. The morning came cold and grey, the kind of weather that made Hank's joints ache and reminded him he wasn't 20 anymore. He'd slept poorly, waking at every sound, convinced each creak of the dock or slap of water against the hull meant someone approaching. By dawn he was exhausted, but alert, running on coffee, and the nervous energy that came with knowing he was being watched. The first coordinate set from his father's notebook lay 40 miles offshore, in waters deeper than Hank usually fished. He spent the morning preparing the second chance, checking fuel, testing the engine, verifying his navigation equipment still functioned. The boat was old and temperamental, but she'd been making this run for decades. She'd make it again. Dwight found him around 10, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of equipment. "Heard you're heading out to deep water," he said, setting the bag on the deck. "Thought you might need this." Inside was a portable sonar unit, better than anything Hank owned, along with a waterproof camera rig and extra batteries. "I can't afford," Hank started. "You're not buying it. Borrowing. Just bring it back in one piece." Dwight's expression was carefully neutral. "Irving mentioned you're looking into your father's disappearance. That's good, Hank. A man should know his history." "Irving talks too much. Irving worries. We all do." Dwight helped him load the equipment, showed him how to operate the sonar. Whatever you find out there, be careful. And if you need help, you call. Doesn't matter what time, doesn't matter why. Understand? Hank nodded, moved by the gesture. Friendship, he'd forgotten, was sometimes expressed in loaned equipment and unasked questions. By noon he was clear of the harbour, the second chance cutting through moderate swells, the coastline receding into haze behind him. The coordinates were programmed into his GPS, a unit so old it still used paper maps as backup, and he followed them with the practiced ease of 4 decades at sea. The journey took 3 hours. The water deepened gradually, the colour changing from green-grey to dark blue-black. Hank passed the usual fishing grounds, moved into territory he'd rarely visited, where the ocean floor dropped away into trenches and ridges that made conventional fishing impractical. When he reached the coordinates, he cut the engine and let the boat drift. The sonar showed depth at 240 feet, not impossibly deep, but deeper than his nets could reach safely. He deployed the borrowed equipment, watching the screen as sound waves mapped the ocean floor below. At first, nothing unusual. Rocky bottom, scattered debris that could have been natural or man-made. Then the sonar caught something, a shape too regular to be natural, too intact to be old wreckage. Hank marked the location, adjusted his position, scanned again. Definitely something there. Metal approximately 20 feet long, resting on a relatively flat section of seafloor. Could be a boat, could be a container, could be anything. Without diving equipment, he couldn't get closer. He deployed the camera rig next, feeding it down on a weighted cable, watching the depth counter tick upward. At 200 feet, the pressure was significant, and the camera's light barely penetrated the darkness. But the images that came back, grainy and green-tinted, showed enough. Wreckage. A vessel of some kind, partially buried in sediment, its hull split open. Not a fishing boat, too sleek, too purposeful in design. And beside it, partially visible, was a cargo container, the kind used for shipping but smaller, sealed with heavy locks that had corroded over the decades. Hank pulled up the camera, his heart pounding. This was it, evidence of the operations his father had been involved in, physical proof that the notebook wasn't fantasy or paranoia. Something had gone wrong here in 1972, and whatever that vessel had been carrying now rested on the ocean floor, waiting. He was so focused on the sonar screen that he didn't notice the other boat until it was within 100 yards. A fishing trawler, larger than the Second Chance, approaching from the east. Hank watched it carefully, ready to haul in his equipment and run if necessary. But the boat didn't approach closer. It maintained its distance, engines idling, clearly visible on the horizon. Watching. Hank pretended to fish, dropping a line, acting casual. The other boat held position. After 30 minutes of this standoff, Hank pulled in his equipment, secured everything, and started his engine. The other boat remained stationary as he pulled away, but Hank watched his radar all the way back to shore. The vessel followed for 10 miles, then turned northeast and disappeared. Someone was monitoring him. Someone knew what he was looking for and wanted him to know they were watching. By the time Hank reached harbor, the sun was setting and his nerves were frayed. He secured the Second Chance, returned Dwight's equipment with minimal explanation, and hurried to the library before it closed. Coraline was waiting, having stayed late after he'd called from the boat. Well? He showed her the photographs from the camera rig, grainy but clear enough. She studied them intently, her expression growing more focused. That's not a fishing vessel. The hull design is wrong. This is a transport boat, the kind used for covert operations. Can you identify it? Not from these images, but I might be able to narrow it down. There were several vessels that went missing in the early 70s. presumed sunk in storms. If this is one of them, there should be records. She looked up. You were followed. A trawler. Stayed just close enough to make sure I saw them. Warning shot, then. They're letting you know you're being watched, hoping you'll back off. Coraline pulled out a folder from her desk, this one newer. I found something while you were out. This was tucked inside a maritime history book that was returned yesterday, a book I know hasn't been checked out in years. She showed him a sealed glass vial, the kind used for preserving documents. Inside was a rolled piece of paper. Hank held it up to the light, saw handwriting, official stamps. I haven't opened it, Coraline said. It was clearly left for someone to find. For you, I'm guessing, if you were looking in the right places. Hank broke the seal carefully, unrolled the paper. It was a photocopy of an official document, dated 1973, stamped Witness Protection Program at the top, a list of names, 6 of them, with dates and case numbers. His father's name was third on the list. The other names meant nothing to Hank, but the implications were staggering. His father hadn't died. He'd been offered protection, had presumably accepted, had disappeared into a new identity while his family mourned. Someone wants you to know the truth, Coraline said quietly. But why? And why now, after 50 years? Hank had no answer. He stared at the document, at his father's name in official type, and felt anger rising to replace shock. Big Hank had chosen to leave, had chosen a new life over his family, witness protection over facing his son and wife with the truth. Every year of mourning, every moment spent wondering, had been based on a lie. There's more, Coraline said. The vial included a note. She handed him a small piece of paper, handwritten. For anyone searching for the truth about 73, check the Port Authority records, summer entries, fuel purchases. The pattern will show you everything. Port Authority records are public, Coraline explained. Maintained in the county archives. If there's a pattern in fuel purchases from that summer, it might reveal the scope of the operation, how many boats were involved, how often they ran. Hank folded the witness protection list carefully, tucked it into his jacket beside the notebook. 2 days ago, he'd been a broke fisherman with empty nets and no future. Now he was uncovering a conspiracy that reached into federal operations and had cost his father everything, or had given him everything, depending on how you looked at it. I need to see those records, he said. Tomorrow. County archives open at 9. Coraline's expression was troubled. Hank, someone is feeding you information deliberately, leading you somewhere. We need to consider why. But Hank was beyond caution. The truth was close now, close enough to touch, and he intended to grab it with both hands. The county archives occupied a basement level of the municipal building, a windowless space that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic neglect. Hank and Coraline arrived when the doors opened, finding a clerk who looked barely old enough to drive, much less manage decades of historical records. Port Authority documents from 1973, Coraline said, with the confident authority of someone who'd made this request many times before, specifically fuel purchase logs and dock fee records from May through September. The clerk disappeared into the stacks, returning 20 minutes later with 3 battered file boxes. Everything's on microfiche too, if you want digital copies, he offered, but Coraline waved him off. She preferred original documents when possible, said. Computers made it too easy to miss details. They spread the contents across a research table, organizing by date. The records were handwritten ledgers, each entry noting vessel name, captain, fuel quantity, payment method, and signature. Most were routine. Small amounts, regular payments, familiar names from the local fishing fleet. But starting in May 1973, a pattern emerged. Unusual fuel purchases, always paid in cash, always at night or early morning. The amounts were significant, enough for extended trips far from shore, and the signatures, while varied, included his father's name 4 times between May and June. "Look at the dates," Coraline said, pointing. "Your father's purchases always fall within 2 days of similar purchases by these other boats." She circled 4 names. "They're coordinating, buying fuel before planned operations, probably meeting at the drop coordinates." One name appeared alongside Big Hank's signature twice: Petrov. No first name, no boat registration, just the single name in the payment witness column. "That's unusual," Coraline noted. "Fuel purchases require verification, usually the dock manager or another captain as witness. But this Petrov signs as witness multiple times, always for the same group of boats." "Who was he?" Coraline was already pulling out her phone, typing quickly. "Give me a moment." She scrolled through search results, her expression growing more intense. "Alexander Petrov, cultural attaché at the Soviet consulate in San Francisco from 1970 to 1973, recalled suddenly in August 73, just weeks after the fishing operations collapsed." "He was the handler," Hank said. The pieces falling into place made his chest tight. "The man running the fishermen, coordinating the drops." "Almost certainly. Cultural attaché is classic diplomatic cover for intelligence officers. He'd have freedom of movement, legitimate reasons to travel the coast, access to resources." She looked up. "If your father was working directly with Petrov, he wasn't just making simple deliveries. He was deeply embedded in the operation." Hank stood, paced the small space between tables. His father, working for Soviet intelligence. It still didn't feel real, didn't match the man who'd taught him to bait a hook and read weather patterns, who'd spent Sunday mornings fixing the family truck and Sunday evenings reading the newspaper in his armchair. But people were complicated. People made choices for reasons that seemed justified at the time, and those choices cascaded into consequences that destroyed everything. His father had needed money. Hank remembered the poverty of his childhood, the way his mother had stretched every dollar, the nights going to bed hungry because the catch had been poor. Someone offered cash for simple work, and Big Hank had taken it, probably thinking it was temporary, probably believing he could stop whenever he wanted. Except you couldn't stop. Not once you were in. The notebook made that clear. His father had been trapped, caught between the Soviets who'd paid him and the federal agents who'd discovered him, with no good options remaining. "There's something else," Coraline said, pulling another document from the stack. "A dock fee receipt from June 15th, 1973. 3 boats paid together, your father's and 2 others. All 3 captains are on the witness protection list." Hank looked at the receipt. The handwriting was rushed, the signature barely legible, but the date stood out. June 15th was 4 days before his father disappeared. "They knew," he said quietly. By then they knew the federal authorities were closing in. This was probably their last run before everything collapsed. "Or before they were offered deals," Coraline corrected. "The witness protection placements are dated June 20th, 5 days after this receipt. The timing suggests the arrests or confrontations happened almost immediately after this final operation." Hank pulled out his father's notebook, flipped to the last entries. June 16th. They know. Don't know how, but they know. The timeline matched perfectly. His father had realized on the 16th that their operation was compromised. By the 19th, he was officially missing. By the 20th, he was in witness protection. 3 days. His father had 3 days between realizing he was caught and disappearing forever. 3 days to decide whether to face the consequences or accept the government's offer. 3 days to choose between his family and his freedom. And he'd chosen to leave. The anger Hank had been suppressing surged back. He could have told us, could have explained, given us a chance to understand. Instead, he just vanished, let us think he was dead. Witness protection doesn't work that way, Coraline said gently. Families can't know. The danger is too great. If you'd known he was alive, that knowledge could have made you targets for whoever wanted him silenced. The Soviets, other smugglers, anyone who feared what he might testify about. So he sacrificed us to save himself. Or he sacrificed himself to save you. Coraline's voice was firm. If the alternative was prison or assassination, if staying meant putting you and your mother in constant danger, then disappearing was an act of protection, not selfishness. Hank wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to his anger because it was simpler than the complicated grief of understanding. But Coraline was right. His father had been given impossible choices, and he'd chosen the option that kept his family safest, even if it meant breaking their hearts. They spent another hour documenting the records, photographing pages, building a comprehensive picture of the operation's scope. At least 12 boats had been involved, making drops and pickups from April through June 1973. The fuel purchases alone suggested hundreds of trips, moving what must have been tons of material. This wasn't small time, Coraline said as they packed up. This was systematic, well-funded, organized. The kind of operation that would have embarrassed both governments if it became public. The Soviets for running it, the Americans for letting it happen so long without detection. You think that's why the records were sealed? Probably. Cold War politics. Better to quietly shut it down, relocate the witnesses, and pretend it never happened than risk international incident. She paused at the archive door. Hank, I need to tell you something. My office at the library was broken into last night. His stomach dropped. Are you all right? I wasn't there, but they went through my research files, took some of the original documents about the smuggling operations. They missed my copies. I keep backups at home. But they were looking for something specific. They know we're investigating. Yes, and they're trying to erase evidence, or at least make it harder to document. Coraline's expression was worried. I think I need to step back. This is getting dangerous, and I have a daughter to think about. Hank understood, even as disappointment settled over him. Coraline had been invaluable, but this was his burden to carry, not hers. Thank you for your help. Seriously. I couldn't have gotten this far without you. I'll keep searching from a distance through academic channels that are safer. But no more direct involvement. She touched his arm. Be careful, Hank. Whoever's watching you hasn't stopped you yet, which means they're either waiting to see what you find, or they're trying to figure out how much you know. Either way, you're in danger. He walked back to the harbor alone, the copied documents heavy in his bag, the weight of knowledge heavier still on his shoulders. His father had been part of something vast and dangerous, something that had reached across oceans and through decades, and now Hank was following the same path, stepping into the same waters that had swallowed Big Hank 50 years ago. The call came at 3 a.m, jarring Hank from uneasy sleep. He fumbled for his phone, nearly dropped it, managed to answer on the 4th ring. It's Coraline. Her voice was tight with urgency. I found something. You need to come to my house. Now. She gave him the address, hung up before he could ask questions. Hank dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. The break-in at the library had spooked her enough to back away from direct involvement, so whatever she'd discovered must be significant enough to overcome that fear. The drive took 15 minutes through empty streets. Coraline lived in a modest craftsman house on the hill overlooking the harbour, lights blazing in every window despite the hour. She opened the door before he could knock, pulled him inside. "I couldn't sleep," she said, leading him to a dining room table covered in documents and laptop computers. "Kept thinking about the witness protection list, about why someone would leave it for you to find. So I started digging deeper, using federal databases I probably shouldn't have access to. Coraline, just listen." She pulled up a document on her laptop screen. "This is a death certificate filed with the state of Oregon in 1974. It certifies that your father, Henry Hank, died of natural causes, specifically a heart attack, in a fishing village in Mexico on March 12, 1974. Hank stared at the screen. The certificate looked official, complete with stamps and signatures. But the witness protection list, exactly. He can't be both dead in Mexico and in witness protection. So I checked the signature on the death certificate. She zoomed in on the bottom of the document. This was signed by a government official named Philip Landry. And Philip Landry's name appears on another document we found, the Witness Protection Placement List. He was one of the federal agents handling the operation. The implications hit Hank like a physical blow. The death certificate is fake. Not fake, official. Legally filed, properly recorded. But yes, false. Your father didn't die in Mexico. The government created a death certificate to explain his disappearance, to give his family closure and prevent questions. Coraline's expression was troubled. This is standard witness protection procedure. Make the person legally dead, issue documentation, close the case. Your father didn't drown at sea. He was officially declared dead a year later to cover the fact that he'd entered protection. Hank sat down heavily, his legs suddenly unsteady. 50 years. 50 years of believing his father had drowned, of mourning a tragic accident, of watching his mother slowly break under the weight of unanswered questions, and all of it had been manufactured, a bureaucratic fiction designed to hide the truth. "There's more," Coraline said quietly. She pulled up another screen, this one showing banking records. "I shouldn't have these. I'll probably lose my library credentials if anyone finds out. But I traced financial activity associated with the name Frank Westerly, one of the common aliases used in the witness protection program during that era." She scrolled through entries. An account opened in Seattle in 1974, regular deposits, modest amounts, consistent with federal stipends, withdrawals for living expenses. The account showed activity for decades. "The last transaction was in 1998, Coraline said. After that, nothing. The account went dormant." "He died," Hank said, his voice hollow, or disappeared again. "Maybe. But here's what's strange. I found property records. Frank Westerly purchased 10 acres of land in Oregon in 1982. Coastal property, valuable but remote. And that property?" She pulled up another document. The deed is still active, held in a trust, with transfer provisions that activate upon certain conditions. Hank leaned closer, reading the legal language that made his head swim. The property was held in trust for biological heirs of Henry Hank, to be transferred upon verification of identity and completion of specified conditions. What conditions? That's not specified in the public record, but the trustee information is interesting. She pointed to a name at the bottom of the document. Lawrence Kimball, retired federal agent, formerly with the U.S. Marshals Service, the agency that ran witness protection. The room seemed to tilt. His father had been alive, had lived for decades after his supposed death, had accumulated property and money, and had arranged for it all to eventually reach Hank, but only under certain conditions, only after Hank did— What? found the capsule, followed the coordinates, uncovered the truth. Someone left that vial for me deliberately, Hank said, understanding crystallizing. The witness protection list, the note about Port Authority records. Someone wanted me to find all of this, wanted me to follow this trail. Yes, and I think I know who. Coraline picked up her phone, showed him a message she'd received an hour ago. Unknown number, text only. He wanted you to understand why. Call this number. You get one chance. Did you call? No. This is your decision, your family. But Hank, she met his eyes. I think your father might have left instructions, set up this entire treasure hunt from beyond the grave. The capsule appearing now, after all these years. The documents being planted for you to find. Someone is executing a plan, following directions left by your father to guide you to the truth. Hank stared at the phone number on the screen, his heart pounding. One call, one chance to learn what had really happened, to understand the choices his father had made, and perhaps to access whatever inheritance had been left for him. I need to make the call, he said. Coraline nodded, set up her laptop to record. For documentation, in case anything happens. Hank dialed with shaking fingers. The phone rang twice before a man's voice answered, older, carefully neutral. You're Henry Hank's son. Yes. Who are you? Someone who knew your father. Someone who helped him start his new life and who promised to help you understand his old one, if you ever came looking. A pause. Your father lived until 2003. He died of cancer in a small town in Alaska, living under the name Frank Westerly. He kept track of you from a distance, knew when you married, when your sons were born, when your wife died. He wanted to contact you many times but couldn't risk it. Why not? Hank's voice cracked, because the people he testified against had long memories. As long as anyone thought he might still be alive, as long as there was any connection to his old family, you were all potential targets. Only after everyone involved was dead or too old to care could the truth be revealed. And now? Now the last of them is gone. Petrov died in 2019, the final link to the operation. Your father left instructions with me before he died. If you ever came looking, if you found the capsule he'd arranged to be planted in fishing waters you frequented, I was to give you the full truth and access to what he left behind. The capsule was planted recently, 6 months ago. Your father paid me well to ensure it ended up in your nets eventually. He believed you deserved to know who he really was and why he made the choices he made. The coordinates in the notebook lead to evidence, wreckage, documents, proof of the operations. And the final coordinate, the man paused. That leads to a safe deposit box in Anchorage. The key is taped inside the notebook's back cover. Everything you need to understand, everything he wanted you to have, is waiting there. Hank's hands trembled as he flipped through the notebook, finding the back cover, peeling away the aged leather lining. There, secured with yellowed tape, was a small brass key with a number stamped on it. Why did he leave? Hank asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why did he choose to disappear instead of facing prison, instead of staying with us? Because staying would have gotten you killed. The Soviets didn't forgive betrayal, and your father's testimony helped dismantle a major intelligence network. If he'd refused witness protection, if he'd stayed with his family, you would all have been eliminated as leverage or revenge. He chose to die in your eyes so you could live in reality. The line went dead. Hank sat in Coraline's dining room for a long time after the call ended, staring at the small brass key in his palm. The metal was cool against his skin, solid and real, proof that the conversation hadn't been a dream or delusion. His father had planned this, had orchestrated this entire revelation from beyond the grave, ensuring Hank would eventually understand. "Alaska," Coraline said softly, breaking the silence. "That's a long way to go." "I have to." Hank closed his fist around the key. "Whatever's in that safe deposit box, my father wanted me to find it badly enough to plan all this. I owe him that much." "You don't owe him anything. He left you. To protect me." The words felt strange in Hank's mouth. Forgiveness for a lifetime of abandonment. "I'm angry about that. Probably will be for a long time. But I understand it now. He made an impossible choice, and he spent 50 years trying to make it right." Coraline nodded, accepting this. "How will you get there? Alaska's expensive, and—" She hesitated, clearly trying not to mention his poverty. "I'll figure it out." But even as he said it, Hank knew the obstacles were significant. He had maybe $300 to his name, no credit cards that weren't maxed out, and a boat that consumed what little money he earned just to keep running. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dwight appeared at Hank's boat the next morning with news about a cargo ship heading north, leaving in 3 days, needing an extra deckhand for the journey. "Captain owes me a favor," Dwight explained. "I told him you're experienced, reliable. He'll take you to Anchorage in exchange, for work. Won't pay much, but you'll get there." Hank felt his throat tighten with gratitude. "Thank you. Your father was a good man, from what I've heard. You deserve to know his full story." Dwight shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to emotional conversations. "Just come back, all right? Harbor's gotten used to having you around." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Hank secured his boat as best he could, worried about leaving her unattended, but having no choice. He organized the documents Coraline had gathered, made copies of everything, stored the originals in a waterproof case. The capsule and notebook went into a safety deposit box at the local bank, insurance against whoever was watching him deciding to steal the evidence. He wrote letters to his sons, something he'd been avoiding for years. The first draft to Gregory was angry and accusatory, a catalogue of grievances and hurt feelings. He tore it up, started again. The second version was honest without being bitter, explaining where he was going and why, acknowledging his failures as a father while asking for nothing in return. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," he wrote. "I wasn't there when you needed me, wasn't strong enough to hold the family together after your mother died. But I want you to know I'm trying to understand why people make the choices they make, including the ones I made. Your grandfather disappeared when I was young, and I spent my life thinking he'd abandoned us. Now I know he left to keep us safe. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but I understand it. Maybe someday you'll understand why I pushed you away. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to live with all that grief and still be a father." He signed it, but didn't mail it. Not yet. He'd decide after Alaska, after he knew the full truth. Paul's letter was shorter, more direct. "I'm going to find out who my father was by learning who his father was. I hope when I come back, we can talk about who we are now and who we might still become." Irving came by the evening before departure, carrying a small bag. "Supplies for the journey," he said, handing it over. Inside were practical things: good gloves, a warm hat, protein bars, a thermos, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, an old revolver. "Just in case," Irving said gruffly. "Alaska's wild country, and you don't know what you'll find up there. Man should be able to protect himself." "Irving, I can't. You can and you will. I'm too old to use it anyway. And it'll give me peace of mind, knowing you're not up there completely defenseless. The old man's expression softened. Your father was my friend, Hank. I should have done more to help your mother when he disappeared, should have told you what I knew sooner. Let me do this now. Hank accepted the gift, understanding it was about more than the weapon. It was about connection, about the way men showed care through practical gestures rather than words. Coraline met him at the dock in the grey pre-dawn hours, bringing a final gift, a USB drive containing everything she'd researched, encrypted and backed up. In case something happens to me or my files, she explained, the truth deserves to be preserved. You've done more than enough. I'm a historian. This is what we do. Document the hidden stories, preserve what others want forgotten. She hugged him briefly, awkwardly. Be careful up there. And Hank, whatever you find, remember that your father was human. He made mistakes, but he also made sacrifices most people can't imagine. The cargo ship was called the Northern Star, a utilitarian vessel that smelled of diesel and rust and long voyages. The captain was a taciturn man named Yates, who showed Hank to a tiny cabin, explained the work schedule, and made it clear he expected no trouble and minimal conversation. That suited Hank fine. The journey north took 5 days. Hank worked deckhand duties, maintenance, cargo management, watches at odd hours. The physical labor was familiar and oddly comforting, requiring just enough attention to keep his mind from spiraling into anxiety about what waited in Anchorage. At night, lying in his narrow bunk while the ship rolled through dark seas, Hank thought about his father. Tried to imagine Big Hank making this same journey north 50 years ago, starting a new life in a place where no one knew him, carrying the weight of a family left behind. Had he been relieved? Terrified? Both? Hank thought about his own sons, about the years of estrangement that had hardened into habit. He'd blamed them for not understanding his grief, for judging him instead of supporting him. But maybe they'd been as lost as he was, as hurt and confused, and he'd been too wrapped up in his own pain to see theirs. His father's story was teaching him something uncomfortable, that love sometimes meant sacrifice that looked like abandonment, that protecting people sometimes required hurting them, and that understanding came too late more often than not. The Northern Star rounded into Anchorage Harbor on a clear morning, mountains rising white and massive in the distance. The city sprawled along the coast, bigger than Hank expected, modern and busy. He felt suddenly small and rural, out of place in this urban landscape. Yates paid him a modest sum for the work, shook his hand once, and sent him down the gangplank with directions to the nearest bus stop. Hank stood on the dock with his duffel bag, the key heavy in his pocket, Alaska spreading vast and foreign around him. The bank was called First National, located downtown according to the address on the key. Hank caught a bus, paid with crumpled bills, and rode through streets that felt alien after weeks in the small Oregon fishing town. Everything here was bigger, faster, more expensive. At the bank, he presented identification and the key to a manager who looked skeptical of his shabby appearance. But the key was legitimate, the box registered to Frank Westerly with specific instructions that anyone presenting proper identification as Henry Hank's biological son would be granted access. They led him to a private room, brought the safe deposit box, left him alone. Hank stared at the box for a long moment, his heart pounding. Inside was the truth, the inheritance, the final message from a father who'd been dead to him for 50 years, but had actually lived 3 more decades, carrying the weight of his choice. He opened the box. Inside the safe deposit box was a bundle of letters bound with string, their envelopes yellowed but intact. Beneath them lay several photographs, and at the bottom, a small wooden box with brass hinges. Hank's hands trembled as he lifted out the letters, saw his name written on the top envelope in his father's familiar handwriting. He untied the string carefully, as if the letters might disintegrate at rough handling. The first envelope was dated October 1974, 4 months after his father's disappearance. Hank opened it, unfolded the pages inside, and began to read. To my son, Hank, if you're reading this, then you found your way to the truth. I'm sorry for that, and grateful for it, both at once. Sorry because you've had to carry the weight of not knowing for so long, and grateful because it means you cared enough to search, to push past the easy answers and find what really happened. I don't have much time to write. They're moving me again next week, further north, deeper into the program. So I'll start with the hardest truth. I'm alive. I didn't drown. I made a choice to disappear, and that choice has haunted every day since. It started simple. A man approached me at the dock in 1971, offered good money for easy work, drop packages at coordinates, pick up packages from the same spots later. No questions, no complications. We were broke, Hank. Your mother was carrying you, and I was barely making enough to keep food on the table. The extra money felt like salvation. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. Just packages in the water, probably just contraband goods, maybe cigarettes or liquor, avoiding taxes. But I knew better, deep down. I knew, and I did it anyway, because I needed the money, and I didn't have the courage to refuse. By the time I understood what I was really doing, passing intelligence, coordinating drops between Soviet operatives and their contacts, I was in too deep. They had proof of my involvement, records that could send me to prison for espionage. And they had something worse. They knew where you and your mother lived, knew your routines, could reach you any time they wanted. So I kept working, kept making drops, kept taking their money, kept digging myself deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was just scared. Scared of prison, scared of what would happen to our family if the truth came out. Scared of being the man I'd become. Then the federal agents came. They'd been watching for months, building cases against everyone in the network. They offered me a deal. Testify against Petrov and the others, enter witness protection, start over somewhere new, or refuse, face trial, and watch my family become targets for everyone I'd betrayed. I had 3 days to decide. 3 days of walking around the harbor, looking at our house, watching you play in the yard, knowing whichever choice I made would destroy something. Stay and go to prison, leaving you fatherless anyway while putting you in danger. Or disappear. Let you think I'd died, keep you safe, but break your heart. I chose to break your heart. God forgive me, I thought it was the kinder option. Better to mourn a dead father than know you had a living one who was a traitor and a coward. They staged my disappearance, made it look like my boat went down in good weather. The kind of freak accident that happens sometimes to even experienced fishermen. Searched for a few days for appearances, then declared me lost at sea. A year later, they filed a death certificate in Mexico to close the case officially. By then I was Frank Westerly, living in Seattle, working construction, trying to forget I'd ever been anyone else. But I couldn't forget. Every birthday you had, every Christmas, every milestone. I knew about them. The marshals let me keep one thing from my old life, a file they updated annually with information about you and your mother. No photos they couldn't explain if someone found them, just typed reports. But it was enough. enough to know you were growing up, getting married, having sons of your own. Enough to know I'd made the right choice, even if it destroyed me to make it. I'm proud of you, son. Proud of the man you became without me. I know your mother had it hard. Know you struggled. I know my absence cost you in ways I'll never fully understand. But you survived. You built a life. You became a father yourself, and that's more than I deserved to know. This letter is just the first. There are others, written over the years, telling you about my new life, about the choices I made and why. I hope they help you understand. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I know I have no right to ask for that. The letter was signed simply Dad, and beneath it was a date, October 15th, 1974. Hank set it down carefully, his vision blurred with tears. He picked up the second letter, dated 1980, and read about his father's life in Seattle, about the loneliness of living under a false name, about watching Hank's wedding announcement in the newspaper and wanting desperately to attend, but knowing he couldn't. The third letter, 1985, described moving to Alaska for work, the beauty of the wilderness, the way the mountains reminded him of the Oregon coast, but felt safer, more removed from the past. Letter after letter, year after year, his father had written to him, knowing the words might never be read, but needing to say them anyway. The letters documented a life lived in shadow, always looking over his shoulder, always aware that revealing himself could endanger everyone he'd left behind. In a letter from 1990, his father wrote about learning that Hank's mother had died. I wanted to come to the funeral, stand in the back where you wouldn't see me, say goodbye to the woman I loved more than my own life. But even that was too dangerous. So I mourned alone in a cabin in the woods, knowing I'd failed her in every way that mattered. I'm sorry, Mary. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved. A letter from 1998 mentioned Hank's wife, Linda, her illness, the struggles Hank faced. I wish I could help, wish I could send money, support, anything. But any connection between us could still be traced, could still bring danger. So I watch from a distance and hate myself for it. The final letter was dated 2002, written in a shakier hand. The doctors say I have maybe a year. Cancer, aggressive. I've arranged for everything to be passed to you after I'm gone, after enough time has elapsed that no one cares anymore about an old smuggling case from the Cold War. The property I bought is yours, land on the Oregon coast, worth something now. The money I saved from my government stipend is yours, and these letters are yours, my attempt to explain the inexplicable. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even ask for understanding. I just need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, and every day since has been lived with the knowledge that I chose your safety over your love. I hope that was the right choice. I hope you had a good life, despite everything. I'm proud to have been your father, even if I wasn't much of one. I love you, son. I always have. Your father, Henry Hank, also known as Frank Westerly, also known as a man who made terrible choices for what he believed were good reasons. Hank sat in the silent room, surrounded by his father's words, and wept. Not just for the father he'd lost, but for the man who'd lived in exile for 30 years, watching his son's life from a distance, carrying the weight of an impossible choice until cancer finally released him from it. When Hank finally composed himself, he turned to the photographs. The first showed a man he barely recognized, his father, aged perhaps 20 years from the last time Hank had seen him, standing in front of a small cabin with mountains in the background. His father looked older, grayer, but healthy The expression on his face was peaceful, but sad, like a man who'd found a measure of contentment, but could never fully forget what it cost. Other photographs showed the same cabin in different seasons, the Alaskan wilderness in its harsh beauty. One image captured his father holding a large salmon, the kind of proud fishing photo that could have been from Hank's own collection if their lives had been different. The last photograph stopped Hank's breath. It was a newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in plastic, showing Hank's wedding announcement from 1982. His father had circled Hank's face in the photo, had written in the margin in small, careful letters, "Proud beyond words." Hank set the photographs aside and opened the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were neat stacks of cash, $100 bills, precisely organized. He counted quickly, his hands shaking. $47,000. Beneath the money was another document, the deed to 10 acres of coastal Oregon property, the same land Coraline had discovered in her research. The property was described in legal language, but Hank recognized the location from the coordinates: waterfront land north of his home harbor, remote but accessible, the kind of property that would be worth far more than his father had originally paid for it. And beneath the deed was a final letter, shorter than the others, written in that same shaky hand from 2002. Hank, this money is everything I saved over 30 years. The government gave me a stipend to live on, but I lived simply, saved every dollar I could. It's not much compared to what I owe you, but it's yours. Use it however you need. The land is yours, too. I bought it in 1982 when I had some extra money from construction work. I picked that spot because it's close to where you live, close to the water we both loved. I used to imagine you discovering it someday, maybe building something there, maybe passing it on to your sons. I know about Gregory and Paul, know about the custody battle, the estrangement. I know because I've lived that pain myself, the pain of being separated from your children, of having them grow up without you, of missing every moment that matters. Don't make my mistakes, son. Don't let pride or grief or stubbornness keep you from your boys. They need you, even if they don't say it, even if they push you away. They need their father, the way I needed mine, the way you needed me. This inheritance isn't just money and land. It's a chance to rebuild, to reconnect, to create something lasting for your family. Build on that land. Bring your sons there. Show them that families can heal, that it's never too late to choose love over isolation. I failed you as a father. I know that. But you don't have to fail your sons. You still have time. You still have a choice. Make it a better one than I made. The money is for you, but I'm asking you to use it for them. For Gregory and Paul. Give them something I never could. A father who stays, who fights for them, who chooses them even when it's hard. That's my real gift to you. Not the money or the land, but the understanding that came too late for me. That being a father means staying, means being present, means choosing your children every single day, even when everything in you wants to run. Stay, Hank. Fight for them. Don't let them grow old, wondering why you left. I love you. I'm sorry. And I hope you can use this to build something better than what we had, Dad. Hank read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper. His father had watched from a distance as Hank repeated the same patterns, pushing away his sons, letting grief and pride create distance, choosing isolation over the hard work of connection. And from beyond the grave, his father was offering him a way back, a chance to break the cycle. He carefully packed everything back into the box, the money, the deed, the letters, the photographs. The bank manager appeared when he called, helped him secure everything in a new box under his own name, gave him copies of the deed and other essential documents. Outside the bank, Anchorage felt different. The city was still foreign and overwhelming, but now Hank had purpose beyond just seeking answers. He had resources, had a path forward, had a mission his father had entrusted to him from beyond death itself. He found the address for Lawrence Kimball in a phone directory at a library, took a bus to a modest neighborhood on the city's outskirts. The house was small but well maintained, with a view of the inlet and mountains beyond. Kimball answered the door himself, an elderly man with sharp eyes and the upright bearing of someone who'd spent a career in federal service. He studied Hank for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something. "You look like him," Kimball said. "Same eyes, same way of standing. Come in." The house was neat and spare, filled with books and photographs from a long career. Kimball offered coffee, which Hank accepted gratefully, and they sat in a living room while afternoon light slanted through the windows. "I protected your father for 28 years, Kimball said. "From 1973 until he died in 2003. He was a good man, Hank, better than he gave himself credit for. Tell me about him." Kimball smiled slightly. He worked construction, mostly, lived simply, never complained, never asked for special treatment. He followed every rule of the program, never once compromised his security or anyone else's, and he talked about you constantly. He did. Every time I visited for check-ins, he'd ask if I had updates on your life. I'd bring him what I could, public records, newspaper mentions, things that wouldn't compromise anyone. When your sons were born, he cried. When your wife got sick, he wanted desperately to help but knew he couldn't. And when he got his cancer diagnosis, his first concern was making sure you'd eventually get everything he'd saved. Hank's throat tightened. He set all this up. The capsule, the trail of clues. He planned it for years. Paid me well to ensure that after enough time had passed, after everyone involved in the original case was dead or too old to care, you'd be led to the truth. He wanted you to understand why he left, and he wanted you to have the means to reconnect with your sons. Kimball leaned forward. He died proud of you, Hank. Died knowing you'd become the man he hoped you'd be, despite everything. That gave him peace. They talked for another hour. Kimball, sharing stories of Frank Westerly's life in Alaska, the quiet dignity with which he'd lived his exile, the way he'd faced death without fear, because he'd finally arranged for his son to know the truth. When Hank left, Kimball walked him to the door, shook his hand firmly. "Your father's last words to me were, 'Tell him I'm sorry, and tell him to stay.' I think you know what he meant." Hank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The journey back to Oregon took 6 days, working passage on another cargo ship, but Hank barely noticed the time. He spent the hours reading through his father's letters again, letting the words sink deeper, understanding not just what his father had done, but why it had mattered enough to plan this elaborate revelation. His father had given him more than money and land. He'd given him a mirror to see his own mistakes reflected in someone else's story, and a map to avoid repeating them. When the ship docked in Portland, Hank took a bus south to the harbor, arriving on a grey afternoon that felt like coming home after a lifetime away. The Second Chance waited at her mooring, weathered but intact, exactly as he'd left her. Irving spotted him from the dock office, raised a hand in greeting but gave him space, understanding somehow that Hank needed time to process whatever he'd found in Alaska. Hank sat in his cabin that first night, the deed and letters spread before him, and pulled out his phone. His hands shook as he scrolled to Gregory's number, the one he'd called so many times without letting it ring through. This time, He pressed dial and waited. It rang 4 times. Then, "Dad?" Gregory's voice, cautious and uncertain, hit Hank like a physical force. "Yeah," Hank managed. "It's me." Silence stretched between them, years of hurt and distance compressed into seconds. Then Gregory said, "Are you all right?" "I am, I have. There's something I need to tell you, something I need to show you. Can we meet? You and Paul?" More silence. "When?" "Saturday. I have something important, something about your grandfather and about us." Hank paused, gathering courage. "I know I don't have the right to ask. I know I've been a terrible father. But I'm asking anyway. Please." "Where?" Hank gave him the address of his boat. Gregory said he'd talk to Paul, said they'd try to be there Saturday afternoon, said nothing more before hanging up. But he hadn't said no, and that was more than Hank had hoped for. The days until Saturday felt longer than the entire journey to Alaska. Hank cleaned the Second Chance obsessively, scrubbed every surface, repaired what he could. He bought coffee and bread from the store, spent money he could barely afford because he wanted to offer his sons something, anything, when they arrived. Saturday came cold and bright. Hank watched from the deck as 2 figures appeared on the dock at 2 in the afternoon. Gregory, tall and serious in a business casual jacket, and Paul, broader and more casually dressed, both of them walking with the careful deliberation of people approaching something difficult. They climbed aboard awkwardly, neither having been on the boat in years. Hank offered coffee, which they accepted, and for several minutes they sat in uncomfortable silence, cups warming their hands, decades of estrangement making even simple conversation feel impossible. "I found something," Hank finally said. He pulled out the notebook, the letters, the photographs. "Your grandfather, my father, he didn't die in 1973. He disappeared into witness protection, and before he died in 2003, he left me all of this." He told them the whole story, from finding the capsule to the journey to Alaska, from the letters spanning 30 years to the inheritance waiting in the bank. Gregory and Paul listened without interrupting, their expressions shifting from skepticism to surprise to something that might have been understanding. When Hank finished, he pulled out the deed. "This is 10 acres on the coast, north of here. Your grandfather bought it and left it for me. For us." He looked at his sons, his voice breaking. "He wrote that I shouldn't make his mistakes, that I should use what he left to bring our family back together." And he was right. Gregory picked up one of the letters, read it silently. His jaw tightened, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "He left you because he thought it would keep you safe." "Yes." "And you pushed us away because—" Gregory's voice caught. "Because Mom died, and you didn't know how to handle it." "I failed you both," Hank said simply. "I was drowning in grief, and instead of reaching for you, I pushed you away. That was wrong. It was my responsibility to be stronger, to be present, to choose you, even when everything hurt. And I didn't do that." Paul spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "We failed you too. We were so angry about the custody thing, about feeling abandoned. We didn't think about what you were going through, didn't try to understand. You were grieving your mother. You had every right to be angry, and you had every right to fall apart." Paul set down his coffee cup. "But you're here now. You came back." "I'm here," Hank agreed, "and I'm asking. I'm not demanding, just asking if we can start over. Not forget what happened, but move forward from it. I have money now, enough to do something with that land. I thought maybe we could build something there together. A business, a marina, I don't know exactly. But something that's ours, that we create as a family. Gregory and Paul exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then Gregory said, "We'd need to take it slow. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight." "I know. And you'd need to actually show up, be present, not disappear when things get hard." "I will. I promise." Paul stood, walked to the boat's railing, looked out at the water. "I have a son now, Dad. Your grandson. He's 3 years old and he's never met you." The words hit Hank hard. A grandson he'd never known about, never met. Another consequence of his isolation, another relationship lost to pride and grief. "I'd like to meet him," Hank said quietly, "if you'd allow that. His name is Kevin." Paul turned back, and there were tears on his face. "And yeah, I think he should know his grandfather. Both of them, in a way. The story of the one who disappeared and the one who came back." They stayed on the boat for 3 more hours, talking in fits and starts, the conversation awkward but genuine. They made plans to visit the property the following weekend, to walk the land together and discuss possibilities. Gregory mentioned his wife might be willing to reconsider some of the custody restrictions if Hank proved he was stable and committed. Paul showed him pictures of Kevin, a bright-eyed boy with Hank's jawline and Paul's easy smile. When they left, Gregory paused at the gangplank. "Thank you for calling, Dad, for not giving up on us. Thank you for coming, for giving me another chance." After they'd gone, Hank sat on the deck watching the sun set over the harbor. The same view he'd watched 1,000 times. But somehow different now. The second chance creaked beneath him, familiar and patient. And Hank thought about the boat's name, about second chances, and the grace of being given opportunities to correct old mistakes. His father had spent 30 years in exile, watching from a distance, unable to repair what he'd broken. But he'd given Hank the tools to repair what remained, the resources, the understanding, the push to choose connection over isolation. 3 weeks later, Hank stood on the 10 acres with both his sons, discussing plans for a small marina and fishing charter business. The property had water access, good anchorage, room to build. Gregory had drawn up preliminary business plans, approaching it with his accountant's precision. Paul knew contractors, had ideas about construction timelines and costs. And there, in a moment, Hank knew he'd remember forever. Little Kevin ran along the shoreline, collecting shells, his laughter carrying on the salt breeze while his grandfather watched, finally present for a moment that mattered. Hank pulled out his phone, took a photograph of his grandson against the ocean backdrop. He'd frame it, keep it close, the way his father had kept that fishing photo of young Hank. But unlike his father, Hank wouldn't have to watch from a distance. He'd be there for every moment he was allowed, would choose presence over pride, would stay even when it was hard. That evening, back at the harbor, Hank filed new boat registration papers. The second chance would remain his home and his livelihood, but now she had co-owners, Gregory and Paul, their names listed officially alongside his own, a symbol of shared investment and shared future. The boat needed work, the engine rebuilt, the hull repainted, systems updated. But they'd do it together, father and sons, hands working, toward a common purpose, building something that would last. Hank thought about his father's final letter, about the instruction to stay, to fight, to choose his children every single day. He thought about the long chain of fathers and sons, the ways pain and absence could echo through generations, and the ways healing could too if someone was brave enough to break the pattern. Standing on the deck as twilight deepened, Hank looked at the ocean that had taken so much and given back so unexpectedly. His father's notebook rested in his cabin, its mysteries solved, its coordinates leading not just to wreckage and evidence, but to understanding and reconciliation. Some things stayed lost forever. The years his father had missed, the time Hank had wasted in isolation, the moments that could never be reclaimed. But some things, Hank had learned, could still be found even after decades of searching. Things that mattered most. Things like forgiveness, understanding, and the chance to choose differently than those who came before. The second chance rocked gently in her slip, patient as always, ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Hank felt ready too.